so let's do it. Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Zach Pozner, Director of Architecture in the Stanford University Architects Office. Welcome to the Stanford's Spring Lecture Series in Architecture, Landscape, and Urban Design. The theme of this year's series is the architecture of joy. In his book, The Architecture of Happiness, Alain de Botton writes, "It is perhaps when our lives are at their most problematic that we are likely to be most receptive to beautiful things." That point was proven in March of 2020 when many of us began sheltering in place in an attempt to flatten the curve. As we continue to emerge from this pandemic, let's reflect together on the incredible value of architecture in all of our lives. Our environment brings us joy, inspires us, and reminds us of our full potential, both individually and as a community. With that sentiment in mind, we invite you to sit back and relax and enjoy the inspirational work of our talented speaker tonight. Before we begin, I want to thank the rest of our team who helps organize this series: Dave Lennox, the University Architect; John Barton, the Director of the Stanford Architectural Design Program; Padma Kutidipudi, and Nick Goulding. I'd also like to thank the American Institute of Architects Silicon Valley chapter for their help in advertising the series and registering our program for continuing professional education. At the end of the lecture, your attendance will be automatically noted and submitted to the AIA. So there is nothing for you to do but sit back and enjoy. Our next lecture is in 2 weeks, and we are pleased to have Casper Mork-Olnez from Mork-Olnez Architects. It will also be on Zoom just like this, so please register for that on our website. The protocol for today's webinar: Blaine is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to have a 10 to 15 minute Q&A session. If you have any questions you think of during the lecture, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and submit a question for me, and I will triage all of those and get to as many of them as I can. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Blaine Merker. Blaine leads the US West Coast practice at Gehl, an urban design and strategy consultancy based in Copenhagen, New York, and San Francisco. As partner and director, he oversees a hybrid practice using behavioral science to inform design. He's committed to championing public spaces as sustainable technology for economic opportunity, health, and social belonging in a diverse society. He co-founded the art and design collective Rebar, Parking Day, and has worked with clients ranging from community groups to tech giants. He earned his master's in landscape architecture from UC Berkeley and a bachelor's degree in history from Reed College. Now, please give a warm welcome to Blaine Merker.
All right. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Stanford, for the kind invitation to talk to you today. This is a real honor, and I'm super excited to share a bit about our practice and actually my journey to this practice as well. So I'll go ahead and share screen and begin the presentation. Let me know, Zach, if that's not sharing right now.
You're all good. I see everything.
All right, great. Thanks a lot. I want to start this conversation in a few parts, and the first one is about technology, but maybe a different way to look at technology than we usually talk about. A technology for collective thriving. Have you ever walked right across a planting bed? Have you ever ridden your bicycle on the sidewalk? Yeah, some of you have. I have. Have you ever jaywalked? Have you jaywalked when you could see perfectly well that there were hundreds of thousands of dollars invested in you not jaywalking? When there were whole legions of engineers and architects and urban designers who had consulted on the best possible way to keep you from jaywalking, but you did because it was the easiest thing to do. It seemed like the right thing to do. Yeah, I'm looking at you. You've done it. Have you ever just wanted to take a rest outside? Has your whole family ever just needed to take a rest outside? Have you ever needed a place to meet a friend outside and made the best of what you found? What if everything that you were doing when you did these things was in fact the correct way to use the city? What if it's those urban designers and engineers and architects who have it wrong? Because come on, we actually kind of, in our heart of hearts, think that the experts do have it wrong most of the time. Because for every gem of a public space that really works well, there are dozens, hundreds, millions of places that are frankly terrible, that don't work well for humans. And yet somehow we are able to use those spaces in spite of that. We assert our dignity and our agency and our personal control and our authorship over the city, and our humanity in the process. We're saving the city heroically when we use the space for ourselves. And here's my theory about what the sort of problem is that maybe doesn't allow us to do that more often, is that in the last 100 years, we have carved up urban space into dozens of professional disciplines. Each one is optimizing its own domain. You've got the health department keeping us free from disease. You've got public works telling us where the curbs go. You've got the transportation department moving the buses. You've got the planning department telling us what we can do in each parcel. Each is optimizing, and each is actually looking at the world in a sort of a plan view and a strategic view, instead of at eye level, instead of in the shoes of the people who are experiencing it. Because of course, that's not how we experience urban spaces, right? We experience them as a totality. We experience a street as a room that goes from wall to wall, building to building. We experience it as a hallway. We experience it socially with the other people who are there. We experience spaces with our whole bodies and our senses as social beings, with agendas and a serious lack of attention. Most often, our kids are pulling at our arm, our phones are ringing, we're half lost and probably looking for the bathroom. And yet, despite all the engineering manuals and vehicle codes, from time to time, we are still able to use the city on our own terms and to create a life together that elevates us, that brings us this humanity and dignity. What we create when we do that, I would like to talk about today in different ways. I call this public life. We call this public life at Gehl. You might call it a nice neighborhood or a place you'd like to vacation or a place you want to live. It's human habitat, except outside. Public life is what people create collectively when they live their lives outside of their homes, workplaces, and car. And even though I'm trained as a landscape architect and have been practicing landscape architecture and urban design for now almost 20 years, I really feel like we've missed a key piece of the puzzle for making good urban spaces as a discipline, as a profession. What if we could use the science of behavior and observation better to crack the code of what makes places magnetic, inviting, and comfortable? What if we treated the way humans naturally behave as the gold standard for design success? What if also by seeing behavior clearly and being able to sort of talk about it in evidence-based terms, we could use it as a force to call on our better nature, our better angels as people, to sort of bend behavior in a productive way towards the society we know we can be. Because it turns out the human animal is highly attuned to the quality of its environment. It won't choose to inhabit places that don't support its physical safety and comfort and enjoyment. So therefore, any investment in environments that are unpleasant, dangerous, boring, perplexing, annoying, or in any way, frankly, lame, those are foolish investments. if one wishes to really optimize for use and optimize for public life. There are some places that people will go to no matter what because they have to. But when we look at sort of investments in public space and plazas and destinations of choice, they have to be really great. Otherwise, people won't make the choice to stay. And I would say if a truly great environment can't be created, then we are much better off investing those resources into something else. We should invest more in schools. We should invest more in fire departments and climate resilience and all the other goals to society that are important, but not to invest in public space for its own sake. Too often in the United States, I think we spend enormous sums building public spaces that are frankly too big, that are not activated. They're too hard to get to, too compromised by noise, by pollution, traffic violence, to ever be really used well. They are essentially aspirational decorations that fail to be deserving of love. And when we separate destinations too much, we fail to get the network effect of these spaces. We displace nourishing mobility, mobility that can be social and interesting or provide us repose and quiet or perspective. We replace that mobility with a kind of mobility, a junk mobility, I would say, that makes us feel bored and trapped and stressed out. We then have less time for the things that make us really happy, exercise, relationships, and building community. And we kind of spend our lives just getting places. And you'll see this is kind of going to be a theme that I'll talk more about. But we have essentially created cities that we spend most of our time trying to get around instead of cities that we spend most of our time truly living in. But cities are experiments. They're always changing. They are our biggest cooperative enterprises. And I think as we inhabit them, our minds collectively begin to take on the shape of the planning principles at work. So cities that separate work and play and family activities across chasms of junk mobility leave us feeling maybe that our time is undervalued. We become susceptible to negative influences during that undervalued time, where we are talking less to our neighbors, we're talking less to the people directly around us, and listening more to maybe the voices on the radio or the things we read on the internet, which we know can not always be a positive force for creating solidarity and community. So we're really living in the planning dreams of 2 or 3 generations ago, and we are working out the consequences of those dreams in our living environment today. So cities that regularly bring us together and allow us to see one another in respectful coexistence will, I believe, and this may be controversial, but I believe that naturally leads to a trust in collective enterprise more. And I think this is something interesting that's happened in the last 10 or 15 years, right? Is that we have personal relationships and family relationships, and then we sort of have our relationship to national politics, and in between is this kind of chasm where we've maybe lost some of the technology for interrelating with the people directly around us in respectful coexistence, not being the same, not being in community with everybody, but being among a kind of a shared recognized humanity with those who occupy our physical sphere. So this talk is really going to be an argument that if we organized our cities around a kind of an understanding of human behavior that trends towards this technology for collective thriving, which we can call public life, I think we'll be better off. A few maybe concrete examples of ways we could be better off. And you can find all kinds of statistics to support the claim, but when you spend time outside in the city, when the city supports you walking around or biking around on your own, urban design alone can account for 90 minutes a week of added physical activity, just through intersection density and the walkability of the sidewalks and having interesting destinations. So that is half of the physical activity you need a week to stay healthy just through urban design. In terms of kind of happiness and well-being, since this is the architecture of joy, removing an hour from your commute by bringing work and home closer together, or making the commute something that you can do easily, can account for the equivalent happiness by people who study, quantifying happiness, of a 40% pay increase. So removing an hour of your commute equals a 40% pay increase in happiness terms. And of course, in terms of sustainability, we know that cities that allow people to move under active mobility on their own, that are neighborhood focused, that are transit focused, is a huge environmental benefit. And I'm going to talk more about this, but the city of San Jose, for example, has made a bet on this, that the city can reduce its carbon footprint by a third just by creating new development that is walkable, close to local jobs and high quality transit. So we can keep going about the benefits, but I think I'm going to take a step back now and introduce myself a little bit more, jumping off from Zach's great introduction, and just kind of tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from as a practitioner and as a person. So a bit about my story. I grew up and was born in the town of Bend, Oregon, which in the 1980s was a mill town, actually a sort of a dying mill town. It's about 20,000 people, kind of a fading downtown, a tourist economy just starting to blossom. And if you know anything about the area now, it's been one of these boomtown success stories. But when I was growing up, the ski industry and the kind of outdoor vacation industry hadn't really taken off in a big way, and it was a pretty quiet place. It was a pretty sort of out of the way backwoods place. But something interesting for me happened when my father got a job as an aircraft mechanic and was posted to Europe, and my whole family moved with him to Amsterdam. And so this is not my family. We do not look like this, but this is what a lot of people in Amsterdam looked like. And this was kind of my first transplant introduction to active mobility. Suddenly we were in a city very different from Oregon, small town Oregon. And there were all of these parents and kids zooming around on bicycles, enjoying themselves, like really enjoying mobility, and things were easy to get to. Everything was kind of accessible without a car. And you could almost think of it as like cycling was a sort of a different kind of being a pedestrian. It's just a faster version of being a pedestrian. And then a few years later, he was reposted to Zurich, to Switzerland. And so we moved to that city. And then I started to really get a taste of a different kind of public transportation system. There were, trains that went everywhere, of course, all of them on time. And by this point, I was a teenager. And at a time in life, when a lot of kids are experiencing a lack of mobility, a frustration with sort of being trapped, I was totally free to go wherever I wanted to. And I used to go to the main train station. I actually commuted to school every day through the train station, would take the train, and sometimes I'd just make a transfer here and just hang out in the main hall of the train station for an hour and just watch people. And it was a public space that I'd never experienced before, but a public space of collective transportation in a way that I just had no precedent to understand this, but there were no cars. It was just people moving among each other. And there was something about kind of the way that the Swiss approached design that I found really interesting too, but I didn't maybe have the words for it at the time. It was this kind of embrace of the natural world, while at the same time having architecture be a kind of a robust and strong force. I mean, the buildings were particular and thoughtful, and they were also juxtaposed with the natural environment, I think, in a very powerful way often. And the Swiss people that I observed living there, despite kind of a culture of being a little tightly laced, there was an earthiness, and folks liked to get outside. They were always outside every weekend. Everyone greeted each other. People swam in the river downtown together. They just sort of inhabited their space collectively. And, it's a slightly homogenous country, and there's all kinds of, reasons you can say why that's maybe easier to do in a place like Switzerland than it might be somewhere else. But it was a template of experience for me that I found very powerful. And when I was then kind of about 16 years old, we moved back to the US, and then moved back to Bend. And the town in that time intervening had really started to change. It started to boom economically. There were lots of folks coming to the city. Things were taking off. And it somehow had lost something really important. There were more roads than streets. People were kind of on the move constantly. And I felt like there was just sort of like a soul maybe that was missing. People were spending more time kind of getting around than they were inhabiting where they were. And this mechanization of the daily life of cities was something that I would start to become kind of obsessed with throughout my career. And so, later on, after getting a degree in landscape architecture with some friends from my class, we started to think about kind of how streets are used in the city. And I found this statistic that streets make up 20 to 30% of the city's area. So that's quite a bit of space, but they dwarf the space that we kind of traditionally think of as public space. So, parks might be 20% of the city's area. Parks might be 20% of the city's public realm, whereas streets might be 80%. So really, in terms of like our focus as a landscape architect, coming out of that training, I was very focused on parks. But actually, here was this huge canvas, right? The canvas of streets. It was much bigger, much more sort of daily impactful on people's lives potentially. And yet we were asking streets to do very little, right? I mean, we're asking them to move people, but what else could they do? And, when we looked at sort of how much area of a street we devote to automobiles versus devote to people, it's 70 to 80% is devoted to cars. And, the rest is sort of the scraps left over, which is everything else. And, I began kind of thinking about this, this is a great drawing to kind of illustrate the idea that we're actually walking around, chasms of the city that we can't access, that aren't for kind of the daily life of inhabiting space. They're for a mechanized version of moving through it. So it was with this, this sort of idea in our heads that I collaborated with a classmate of mine, John Bella, and Matthew Passmore, who were the co-founders of a group called Rebar, which is an art and design collective that we started in the early 2000s. And one of our first projects was this project called Parking Day, which turned out to be one of our most photogenic and widely shared projects, and one of the most sort of social, sort of a social sculpture project, as it were. So what we did was we looked at the city of San Francisco and what parts of the city were underserved by public open space. We found this area south of Market on First and Mission, and this is what it looked like in 2005. We researched the parking code, discovered that nothing in the code really prevented you from doing something other than park a car in a parking space if you wanted to. You could do anything you wanted. There was just a time limit of 2 hours, and you had to feed the meter. So we said, great, we're going to exploit that niche in the code, and we're going to feed the meter, and we are going to build a temporary public park in a parking space. And just sort of invite a different interpretation of what the street could be. And so for those 2 hours, we fed the meter. For a while, nothing happened. People kind of walked by slightly embarrassed to look at it too long, because what are you supposed to do with this space? And then the gentleman over on the right in the blue shirt came and sat down with his pizza and started eating it. didn't know who he was. We parked kind of, or we stationed ourselves across the street on a parking garage and filmed it. And then after a few more minutes, he took off his shoes. And that seemed like a signal maybe to the other gentleman who was walking by, and he saw the shoes off and the pizza, and he came and sat down on the tree. And we realized, hey, we should have had 2 benches instead of 1. And the idea of Parking Day was born. Folks started contacting us from around the world because this went up on a blog, and we got emails from folks in Italy and Germany and Australia saying, hey, can you come and do this in our city? We had basically spent the $500 we had on this particular installation, and we rented the tree and had to bring it back. So we decided we should write an open source manual to allow anyone to recreate the day. And we set the 3rd Friday in September as the day on which everyone in the planet could do this together in unison. So we could maximize the amount of global parking space, open space that we would provide on that day. And we're kind of inspired by the open source software movement at the time. Like, how can we just sort of like set the intention around this thing, embed the values, have it be commercial free, like it is a generous offering. It's not to sell anything. Be safe, have fun, pick up after yourself, try and do it sustainably, and then do it as much as you can and kind of let it blossom. And blossom it really did. Some folks might have encountered Parking Day out there in the world before. It is a open source, crowdsourced event that still goes on to this day, and we don't support it really at all. And people kind of interpret the project as they will, right? They put in little libraries, they express their creativity, they most importantly collaborate with friends. And I think this has been one of the most exciting things about it. Is it's a piece of social architecture that allows people to collectively have agency out in public where they didn't before. So that was neat. And it has been a tremendous gift to stumble on this idea, but I don't think this was the most important thing about Parking Day. Really what was interesting is kind of what happened next after a few years. The San Francisco Planning Department spotted this idea. They reached out and said, hey, we love this. How can we make this permanent? We have this idea of something called maybe Parklets that could be like a permanent parking day, but just more durable. And it would allow us to create more public space in the city, kind of, with minimal investment. We can crowdsource the installations from, neighboring businesses. So we consulted with them on that. And one of the key questions at the time was, is this going to be a commercial space, or is it going to be a public space, truly an offering to anybody? And I credit the city, Andres Power at the time in the mayor's office, really with taking the stance with us that this should be an entirely public space, that you don't have to purchase a drink to go hang out in a parklet. And San Francisco has maintained that throughout, and they actually have that sign, that plaque on all their parklets, and mostly other cities have followed suit. And this is now a template. This is a pattern that's been propagated around the world. So we built a lot of the initial parklets and kind of piloted that idea. And then that idea spread around the world. We did a lot of other things over the years at Rebar that I'm not going to get into, but we built amphitheaters out of car hoods. We built social science interpretive play spaces outside the Exploratorium. We even built a pedal-powered park once we had exhausted all our other ideas for Parking Day installations. And for quite a while, we kind of dabbled in inflatable urban technology, personal space softening devices, if you will. And by 2014, after several years of doing this, I had an opportunity, and we had an opportunity at Rebar to take a leap. And we met another practice based in Denmark that would change the course of my professional career and added another really key part of the puzzle that I didn't realize had been missing, which was the ability to measure the effect in human terms of what design does. So I'll kind of rewind to tell this part of the story to this gentleman here. This is Jan Gehl. his name is on the door, so to speak. And if you're not familiar with him, he's kind of the father of thinking that brings together design and behavior. Sometimes I say he's like, Jane Jacobs and Holly White melded together in Denmark. But I think he has even a sort of a different spin that he brought that I'll try and articulate well. And it'll kind of help to tell his story. So rewinding back to 1966, this is Jan in his small Danish apartment with his wife, Ingrid. So Jan has recently graduated in this photo from architecture school. He's trained as kind of, post-war modernist leaning Scandinavian architect. His wife, Ingrid, is trained as a sociologist. And so, maybe here sitting on the couch, she's asking him, Jan, you're building these buildings. You're designing these housing projects. Do you know anything about what's happening in the spaces between these buildings, what people's lives are actually like? And Jan realizes, no, I don't actually know. We're just focused on the form and focused on this kind of idealized form of living, but we don't know anything about what's actually happening. So she teaches him sociology, and the two of them use these methods, and they go to Europe together. They go to Italy to go look at places where public life thrives. This headline says he's not a beatnik, actually. He's an architect with a sketch pad, and they go and study places like the Campo in Siena, the plaza, where people are enjoying public space. And he comes back to Denmark and he writes a book called Life Between Buildings. And it's this basic idea about what are the mechanics, the social mechanics of life between buildings. And he takes this idea back to his Danish counterparts, and they say, that's great, Jan, that's great, but it's cold here and we're not Italian. This kind of thing will never work. We're not a cafe culture. And in fact, if you're familiar with sort of the Danish and Scandinavian exceptionalism around livable cities, you might think that these places have always been sort of these great, humane places. In the 1960s and 70s, they looked like every other car-dominated city, full of cars, choked with traffic, full of that junk mobility. So Jan starts to send people out into the field. They have lots of data about cars and traffic. Nobody has data about what people are doing, how they're spending time. So he sends his students out. This is obviously not one of them. This is one of our volunteers working on a survey more recently. And he sends them out to study how people are moving, age and gender, and what people do when they stay. And this becomes the basis of a practice, sort of that comes down to eye level and looks at the senses as the basis of truth, as the basis of human experience. So we experience the city mostly through our eyes from a distance of sort of 90 centimeters to 160 centimeters off the ground, fairly low, and through our ears and our sense of smell, but most importantly through our eyes. And in this kind of cone of vision that's about 70 degrees, but importantly tilted slightly downward, which means that it's the ground floor of the building that occupies most of your mental space as you walk around. You're not really aware of what's happening way above you, right? So the ground floor is super important. It's important because we need 1,000 stimuli per hour to stay interested in our surroundings. So that means that I have to say something new and interesting about every 4 seconds in this talk to keep you interested and engaged. And in the city, when we're walking at 3 miles an hour, that 4-second rule translates into about 25 feet, which incidentally is the scale of a lot of the facade lengths of walkable streets that we really appreciate, because you're getting something new kind of every 4 seconds. And retailers know this, right? They put the little things out that call to your senses to get you to slow down, because you're trying to optimize for that 4 seconds, right? You're trying to say, oh, there's more stuff here. I'm going to slow down so that I get a new thing every 4 seconds. So he applies this thinking to the city of Copenhagen with city government, and they pedestrianize kind of one street, which, if you know it today, is kind of the main shopping street, and over time continues to do this study, this survey, and measures public life every year to see how things have changed. And over time, Copenhagen has pedestrianized a huge network of their city. And this has been the result. It's been moving from a place that's sort of dominated by movement to a place that's dominated by staying, a place dominated by machines to a place dominated by human bodies. And it hasn't just kind of stayed in the streets. It's actually been extended to the waterfront as well. The Copenhagen waterfront was a dirty industrial harbor 50 years ago. Today, people swim in it. And guess what? They are still not Italian. It's a totally different, unique, particular version of public life. One that kind of embraces who they are. And I think this is sort of what the promise and potential of this way of working is. It's a way of finding out who you are. When you spend time together outside, you start to form a very distinct identity. And so capturing that identity and that sort of footprint has really been the basis of what we call the public space and public life study. We've done it in a number of cities around the world. We've conducted more than 300 cities. And this is now the basis of our practice. We have over 80 people at Gehl in Copenhagen, New York, and San Francisco. We're sociologists, planners, architects, landscape architects, and anthropologists, all of us trying to create cities for people. And have to sort of show what our services are. And I won't talk about all of these today, but we sort of span the gamut from street design, master planning to organizational strategy and public life strategy, but always with this lens of looking at life first, then space, then buildings, and really acknowledging that user experience eats design for breakfast always. I'm going to kind of skip quickly through because I think it's just sort of for background that we have more updated ways of gathering this information. We gather it digitally. We look at age and gender, or perceived gender. We look at how people are moving. We look at what people do when they stay, what activities when they stay. And then we have a lot of sort of online ethnography that we do as well. So this all kind of feeds into a database where we can compare different streets, different places, and see how they're performing socially to one another, and get ideas really about each project from other places that we've worked with. And we can get very particular with kind of the things that we study. We can look at, are people carrying fresh food? Are they buying vegetables? Are they eating while they walk? Sort of whatever you want to optimize for, there's a way to do ethnographic observation for that. But we also really look at the quality of public space as well, because this has an effect on kind of, as I was saying at the beginning, whether people choose to stay. So I think the key takeaway from this diagram is that the aesthetic quality of a space is really what designers focus on quite a bit, but we can't appreciate that aesthetic quality without a foundation of safety, comfort, and protection. And then we can build everything else on top of it. And when we look at how different spaces perform in terms of stickiness, in terms of staying power, how many people are staying versus how many people are moving, we see patterns like this. So the place on the left, we have 700 people moving through per hour and 18 people staying. Place on the right, 700 people moving through per hour, 258 staying. So it's not about old or new architecture. It's really about those quality criteria that you see at the top. It's how many of those qualities have been met by these different places in the ones where more people choose to stay. I'm going to briefly share two stories now because I would be remiss not to actually talk about how we put this into practice, but I'm going to kind of keep this brief. I want to share two quick projects of totally different scales. And these are not our most recent projects, but they're ones that sort of show how we use these methods. So the first one is Times Square, which, as anyone who's been there in the last few years knows, that it's changed a lot in the last decade. Before, it was kind of primarily dominated by cars and car space. Today, it has a kind of a wonderful plaza designed by Snohetta. But the backstory on this is, in 2008, it looked like this. And we were invited by the Bloomberg administration at the time to understand how this plaza worked and make recommendations about how to change it. But, they were data folks. They really wanted to see numbers. We did a lot of public life study of it. This was the one statistic that probably made the most difference. And we could talk for a long time about the strategic value of picking particular numbers, right? But this one really mattered. In Times Square at the time, 10% of the area was devoted to pedestrians. 90% was devoted to moving cars. Yet when you counted the people there, 90% of the people in Times Square were walking and 10% were driving. So the use and the design of the space were exactly flipped. And I swear we didn't make these numbers up. This is actually what it was. So this kind of gave New Yorkers the courage to try something. And the first thing was just to put out lawn chairs in the space to reclaim it, cheap lawn chairs from Costco. New Yorkers said, this isn't like up to what we really deserve. We need a better public space. So the next stage was paint and umbrellas and, kind of a cafe sort of vibe. And over time that was enhanced and enhanced. We continued to measure what was happening, just as we had done in Copenhagen. And the results empowered and emboldened the city to really make an investment in concrete and stone, right? But the numbers actually really tell a great story as well, right? So there was a 35% decrease in injuries, fewer pedestrians in the roadway, actually an improved travel time, even for cars. 3/4 of folks said that Times Square had improved, had changed for the better. So you can still sort of get accosted by, someone in a like Mickey Mouse costume. It's not for everybody, right? But it's I think a reclaiming in a really amazing way of the city for people. But it's what that enables, right? It's the ability to have a snow fight in the middle of a snowstorm where you wouldn't have before, to have this moment of camaraderie. It's moving the city to be more of a walking culture, which is, recognized in this cover magazine, that New York is sort of awakening again as a walking city. And it's also how this idea propagated. I mean, Times Square is only the most visible manifestation of this approach, but really it's what was happening out in the boroughs, kind of using the same techniques. So we're studying these different little, throwaway spaces and saying, how can we reclaim this? And then what do the numbers tell us about how people use that space once you do? And it's interesting, right? More people, 50% of folks say they recognize more people out on the street after these got put in. People who make the lowest income actually report that they're most likely to make new connections using public space. So, there's some real benefits that have kind of trickled down beyond just sort of the charismatic case of Times Square. And then turning to a totally different kind of city, Lexington, Kentucky. So we did a similar public life study there. We studied how people were moving throughout the city, and it's a vibrant place. We saw that some places there were like 1,000 people per hour. There's a vibrant restaurant scene, but it was really for a certain segment of the population. It was for kind of 20-somethings and 30-somethings, and we observed through the data that less than 5% of the people spending time were under 14 years old. Where were they? So we went out, we started fanning out to look for the like under 14-year-olds. And what we found was, because it's hot in Lexington in the summer, that they were out in the fountains trying to cool off. Well, it turns out you're not allowed to swim in any of the fountains. So here we have a city that is sort of outlawing the one thing that, a 14 or a 13-year-old kid needs to do in the summer. And we asked, can we do better than this? And can we test and pilot in the same way as we did with Times Square, kind of the solution, and see where that leads us? So we looked at some different sites, and this one kind of right across the street from Thoroughbred Park, that fountain that I just showed, was this kind of like little lost scrap that people didn't go to much. And we thought maybe this is a place to test this out. And it was interesting demographically because Northeastern Park was just this kind of bare lawn. It sort of has great potential. And it's right at this kind of intersection of a bunch of different demographics. This is a little hard to interpret this chart, but it's, different incomes, different educational levels, different racial compositions in the neighborhood around it. So it's sort of an ideal mixing site. So we asked, could this fill a latent demand for young people playing in the water and cooling off, and can at the same time be a catalyst for social mixing? So with that idea, Splash Jam, the idea for Splash Jam was born. We set some criteria for success. We wanted to make sure that we sort of hit these things and measured afterwards how well the temporary installation did that. And what we found was that after installing this temporary water park, folks who rarely visited the park now were visiting it weekly. We found that, you know, there were about 20 people walking per hour. Previously, now there were about 40 people, so it's almost doubled. People are staying, right? Those quality criteria, people are moving through, but they're also choosing to stay. 1 in 3 folks recognize someone that they didn't plan to meet there. People have spent a great deal of time, over an hour for most people. And then people are starting to appropriate the space. They're bringing their own furniture in and customizing the space. And it's starting to reactivate some of the kind of forlorn playground equipment that's next door. So overall, pretty good. It did sort of preference some income groups over others. And so that was kind of a learning to inform the next iteration. And it was very successful at bringing more women into the park, which is a great indicator of kind of the quality of the space. So all of this informed fundraising efforts in Lexington, and sort of in the last actually 3 months, the city has raised several $1 million of additional money through foundations and local matching to build a permanent version of this park, which will be on Lexington's east side. But I think kind of all because of the, you know, data gathering and storytelling that Splash Jam did, really supported that longer term investment. So I'm almost out of time, and I want to end on one kind of important thing. I think it's the important thing, and I'll try to make this somewhat fast, but it's a big topic. So we talked about sustainability at the beginning, and I want to center on the cities that we really need now, because this idea of just having space that we live in and we claim is great. But I think that there is a solution in that collective reclamation of the city for human beings that aligns very well with the solution to the climate and sustainability crisis that we are in now. And you've probably seen, you know, statistics like this before. You know, 78% of the planet's energy is consumed by cities. 60% of the greenhouse gases come from cities. 25% of the historic emissions come from the United States. So you put all this together, and we have a huge responsibility and opportunity in our country to have our cities do better and be the solution to climate. So I took a role a few months ago as Gehl's head of climate action, which means that I'm sort of corralling everything we do towards, you know, climate goals when possible, and really looking at this kind of overlap between human-centered cities, low carbon, low energy intensive cities, and resilient cities. So that's the sweet spot where we're trying to focus our practice. And I think there's a particular solution that the urban environment can offer here that aligns with public life. And it's mostly around kind of transportation and movement, right? So, you know, half of our greenhouse gases in California come from transportation. 30% of the total share of greenhouse gases come from private cars in California. That's because we have solved our housing and our jobs imbalance. We've solved sprawl, we've solved economic opportunity, bringing people from distant places into the city to commute long distance. We've solved it all with private automobiles. We can't continue to do that, even if we shift over to electric. And the promise is that 30 to 75% of our total emissions can be reduced just through transit-oriented development. So if we can move people into transit adjacent neighborhoods, into jobs housing balance, we can really tackle a huge amount of our climate issue in California and elsewhere. And you can sort of see this like in the footprint of places like Atlanta and Barcelona, right? Where you have a city of roughly the same, you know, 5 million people, with a vastly different carbon footprint, really because of movement. It's really because of how much junk mobility we have in these cities. So, where can we intervene in the development cycle? Well, we can intervene in the beginning with building less, and we can intervene at the end by running things efficiently. And those are kind of where the behavior levers are, right? If we can change human behavior, we can intervene at the beginning and just not even have to build certain things, which bakes in emissions, or we can optimize later, but it's much better to sort of intervene at the beginning. And I think the kind of intervention we need is towards a city that we call the soft city. So I'll kind of end on what that soft city looks like and what it is, and leave you with this. The soft city has the right density to create sort of vibrancy and efficiency. It has diversity in proximity to provide access to everything you need. People talk about the 15-minute city. It should provide safe and enjoyable people-centered movement as the first option, always. There should be technology for sharing, because we need to share more in order to have less of a carbon footprint, less of an environmental footprint. And we need to make virtuous activity, the path of least resistance. And I'll explain what I mean. So right density, what does that mean? Well, in the US, we kind of are like single family homes or, giant towers. But there's another kind of density out there, right? Which is this kind of middle density, which is actually quite nice when it comes to creating public life, right? So you can have the same amount of density in towers, in perimeter blocks and slabs, or in kind of, small courtyard blocks. But some of them create a much higher surface area for public life to happen in. And of course, it's not just the building that's really the building block of the neighborhood, right? It's the block, and each building is different within a block. The right density supports the right level of public life. You have to have enough stuff going on around a public space to activate it. So we've kind of found that, under 10 people is like not active enough. Over 40 feels too crowded, but that kind of 20 to 40 range is really great. And, we look at how different spaces kind of perform along this spectrum, and no surprises here. It explains why, a place like the Vienna Art Museum Plaza kind of feels a lot better than Civic Center in San Francisco. It's just because Civic Center is too big, really. Diversity and proximity means having everything you need around you and having different things around you at kind of small scale. Coffee shops next to a bike repair. I think Moment in San Jose has been a great experiment in sort of creating density and diversity. And you can have these magical adjacencies, like having a bar right next to a park where you can kind of watch your kids. And that diversity allows for a kind of a smoothing out of the public life profile of a place so that it's active more parts of the day. And really seeing the details of, a neighborhood, people can share with each other. They can share their personalities, share their kind of that gradient of public to private. And then speaking of sharing, this technology of sharing is public life happening in public spaces. The spot in Lake Merritt is really one of my favorites, but it's also things like, courtyards that expand the usable space you have in maybe a smaller apartment. It's sharing the burdens of parenting with others. And we started to see more recently how our streets have become technology for sharing with things like open streets events. And of course, we have to remember that there are forces kind of arrayed against sharing, right? Redlining, historic legacy of redlining, and also kind of the big sort. Our politics has sorted us into different places. So we really have to index hard on, our neighborhood spaces and seeing people who are different from us. And then on people-centered movement, right? Streets have to be absolutely kind and generous to people. There's so much going on in the street. This is outside of our office in Copenhagen. But, the sidewalk stretches across the cross street, and there's still box trucks making deliveries. There's still lots of different kinds of vehicles. And when you see kind of an American street after seeing that you're like, what are we doing? You know, this is such an unkind environment. And when you read the statistics about how many people would bike, especially people of color, women, who cite safety as the #1 reason why they won't do it. In Berkeley, where I live, 90% of people say they'd like to bike, but only 10% actually bike. And it's because of the comfort of the street and the safety of the street. And there's so much we can do that just is this like little kindnesses, right? You can be sweet to people, as they say in Denmark, and you can use the same material at about the same cost to be mean to them, right? So it's a choice. But it's about understanding what the human animal needs. You know, it needs to be protected and slow, protected from fast traffic. And there's a market for this. I mean, I won't get into this graph, but there's a premium on walkable urban neighborhoods. We have a market shortage of them currently. And then finally, you know, this idea of virtue being the path of least resistance. Make it easy to do the right thing. When you ask Copenhageners why they cycle, it's not for the environment. It's not because it's cheaper. It's not really for exercise so much. It's because it's the fastest and easiest thing to do. So if you make it the fastest and easiest thing to do, people will do it. We have to take a page from like app design and product design. We got to make these things, these urban products, irresistible, addictive even. And this is why, right? Copenhageners plow the bike lane before they get around to plowing the car lane. So this has been a long talk. I appreciate your tuning in for this long. The city is a story of what matters to us. So we can choose that story. This is a time for a new story, a new dream for our cities, for our planet, for our civilization. The city is the text that we're going to write that story in. And I appreciate you considering these ideas that I shared today and look forward to staying in touch. Thanks.
Thanks, Blaine. That was excellent. I wrote down a lot of questions. And I see a couple of questions coming in from the attendees already. So please keep bringing those in the Q&A section, and I'll try to get to a lot of these. I'm thinking about like how to politely play devil's advocate with you on some of this stuff, because I live in a city.
Yeah.
I live in the city of San Francisco, and I'm so frustrated with some of these things, particularly the transportation planning aspects. But I want to start with some less controversial stuff. Can you tell us a little bit about the composition of Gehl as a firm? How many people, what background, training most of them have?
Yeah, you bet. Well, we're about 80 people altogether. Actually, a little more now. Most of the offices in Copenhagen, maybe about half, and then the other 2 offices are, you know, sort of the remainder in New York and San Francisco. In terms of training, we're a mix, really a pretty balanced mix of architects and landscape architects and urban planners, with a kind of a sprinkling of computer programmers, anthropologists, and sociologists kind of thrown in there. I would say one pattern is that a lot of the architects have never really practiced architecture. They did, and then they got out. So it's I think, you know, we don't do buildings. We don't design and build buildings. We sort of know how buildings go together, and we can think in floor plans, but we're really also trying to think about how buildings work with each other more. So that's the composition of the firm. And I'm trying to think of what else kind of behind the scenes to share. I mean, we're always looking for new expertises because we're kind of working at this intersection of a lot of things. So, you know, folks with kind of unlikely backgrounds are always appreciated.
It's very similar to the composition of our university architect's office. So that's pretty good to know. You started with the premise that designers and planners are typically doing it wrong, and that a firm like yours is going to help us all see the righteous path. And I'm just wondering, who are you typically partnering with for clients, and when is the right time to engage a firm like Gehl to maximize, you know, your input?
Yeah, and you know, I mean, that's a provocation a little bit because we work and collaborate with architects and landscape architects all the time, and I think having practiced kind of more traditional landscape architecture and urban design for several years, also in a local firm, I have a real appreciation for what it takes to get something built and kind of all of the problem solving and different compromises that kind of go into that. I think what we try to do and where we could add the most value is to be at the front end, often setting this trajectory and focus on how people behave and kind of thinking through, well, what are all the different ways this could kind of go, not wrong, but just go differently than you'd think? And how can we leave open our recourse to change course along the way? So how can we sort of not cast everything in steel and stone before we really see how it is functioning? So we really kind of, when we can, kind of promote an iterative test-based approach. So we often kind of set up that kind of framework early on in the process and try and set a strategy that is maybe somewhat humble in terms of the design intentions, so that we can kind of make changes along the way. So that's often sort of where we're at. But I think that the key contribution we can make is to think about the culture of the place that we're making. I mean, we think in terms of like, what is this common culture that a design will engender? And can we be very explicit about what we want that culture to be, and sort of seed the invitations in the design to make that possible? And we never really know if it's going to take root, right? You can't totally control culture or what people do, but we want to be very intentional about that kind of before we start designing it all. And I would say that's kind of what maybe I think designers get wrong, is we put pen to paper too quickly. We reach for a detail that we know has worked before, and we throw it down before we've really thought about, like, what are we trying to do here?
So in a lot of cases, it seems like you're partnering with city planning or an individual neighborhood, but are you also working with corporate clients, or academic clients like us that, to look at really like a specific campus and their catchment area, their population, their culture?
Yeah, you bet. We're working, about a third of our work is with municipalities, with cities, and oftentimes supported by a foundation partner, because let's just say it's not always in the city budget to hire like a public space ethnographer. So we'll partner with a foundation and do work for a city often. About a third of our work is with developers, and sometimes that's like a corporate campus or a housing developer, or a academic campus. And we've done some work with Stanford, which has been awesome and super fun. And then the other third is with corporations. So I'd say like companies that sort of have some interest in how the public realm interacts with their business, right? So like micromobility companies, that are relying on the public realm to deliver their product or service. And in those cases, we're trying to sort of bridge the business interests of that client with the public interest. That because we have city clients, we have to we sort of have to represent that well too, right? We wouldn't continue to get business with our city clients if we kind of sold out to every company that wanted to sort of sell a new product in the city. So that's an interesting and more recent evolution of the practice, just to be totally honest. And we're trying to figure it out and kind of figuring out what the right clients are to take. But I feel that private companies have had so much say in the public realm through cars, through the way we get around, through, what have you, that it would be sort of foolish to not have the conversation with them about what we're making in the city. And sort of like, I want to engage that as creatively as a consultant if we can.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think about what would your metrics for success be on like a new corporate campus. And I put on my real estate developer cynical hat and was like, well, if you create all this sticky space, then you're driving revenue, you're driving higher rents, because people are there, it's popular, it feels safe. And they like occupying those spaces, renting those spaces, having coffee in those spaces. Is that the kind of conversation you're having with some of these clients now, or are they zeroing in on those sort of return on investment numbers?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely, the real estate perspective, right? Is like, let's face it, public life is also, uh, sales revenues for the ground floor. And then this whole like kind of era of like questions about the future of retail. This is a hot topic if you're in real estate. And so, corporate clients that are developing urban campuses and where ground floor retail is a part of that because of their agreement with the city or because that's their philosophy on how to make a good corporate campus. We are absolutely doing some of that work and having those conversations. And I think a real interesting and difficult twist, to be honest, is some of those companies have intellectual privacy concerns and mixing concerns about their employees sort of mixing with the public in an uncontrolled way, right? So there's this sort of different gradient of public to private you've got to think about. And I think, yeah, it's always sort of like what's the line you can walk here to really kind of keep the public interest in mind? Because at the end of the day, these things are happening usually because of some sort of a planning or an entitlement agreement that a city has asked for something in the public interest, and so that company needs to provide that for them. So that's what we're trying to look out for in the end. But it's a complex question, and I think it's really interesting to see companies kind of coming back into the city and coming back to the ground floor and seeing these come up.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting coming out of the pandemic. It seems like there was this massive flight from the cities, right? People wanted more space during the heart of the pandemic, certainly, and you saw suburban, property values go way up, and the city values start to go down a little bit, and really just the serious urbanites stuck around, let's say, right? And so in a way, your work is perfect for this moment for those folks because we have all these parklets. We embraced our outdoor life as much as possible, in a pre-vaccine world. And we don't want these things to go away now. We love them, and we love the outdoor dining and the heat lamps and everything we got in the last few years. But at the same time, there's all these folks that move to the suburbs and probably aren't coming back anytime soon. So you still have this issue of single occupant vehicles for when they are hybrid working. They're starting to commute again. So how do you think this pandemic is changing the way that you're engaging with folks and thinking about your work in general?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and it's still so much unfolding right now that it's like anyone who's sort of predicting how this is gonna land is probably wrong. Um, I think one of the interesting things that happened during the pandemic for me was watching people sort of notice their neighborhoods again. And suddenly, you're taking a break from your Zoom calls and you're kind of walking around in your streets. And you're like, oh, there's my neighbors. Like, I haven't ever been here at this time to see that person. And the question is that going to reignite kind of a public life in neighborhoods? Like, are we, by spending more time in hybrid work at home, is that going to fuel places that are not the center city? Because frankly, you could say that maybe the center city was overheated. Like we were all just slaving away through our commute to get someplace and then get home. I mean, what if we could create something maybe just as vibrant, but a little different, kind of more locally? So that would be sort of one interesting thing to see if that happens. Is do we start to see a more polycentric kind of central business district world pop up, and I think some of the tech companies are starting to kind of explore this, right? Like some of the big ones are saying, we're going to have these anchor days. Some of them are saying you can pick work from home or work in the office. You can like choose one or the other. So are we going to have separate populations of people who are actually anchored in their neighborhood? And, these companies are also giving money to people to invest in their home offices. So I don't know where it's going to go. I can tell you that we've worked a lot with cities to think through how they make these pandemic changes more permanent. We started a pedestrianization study for Castro Street in Mountain View right before the pandemic hit, pivoted really quickly and turned it into a pilot project for a pandemic outdoor dining space. And now we're working with the city to think through design guidelines for how that pandemic space, which is sort of, a little ad hoc, is going to transition to a more permanent space and eventually to a permanent pedestrianized street. So I think some of the cities are kind of thinking of this as like a bridge that can slingshot them towards an objective that they might want to have done anyway.
Right. I'm going to read a couple from our audience now. Do you think the solution for better cities is in tackling transportation or changing zoning and density in the cities?
I mean, it's all of those. They all interrelate. So I think we've seen cities like where I live, Berkeley has, started to study and ultimately is going to do away with single family zoning. So there's this kind of, unlocking the city again to be more polycentric and maybe denser, which I think would be a good thing. I mean, I live in a single family house, but, vibrant public life comes from different zoning, actually. Transportation just is part of that, right? I think we're seeing like this tipping point with e-bikes. People are getting on e-bikes and realizing that it can kind of displace a good amount of what they use their cars for. And there's an interesting thing that happens in Copenhagen, which is a very high cycling proportion, but people also drive. The important thing though is that people who drive also cycle, and they switch throughout the week and the day, which means that when they're in their car and they are stopping for somebody on a bike, there's a great deal of empathy for that person. It's not a kind of like, why are you biking and slowing me down? It's like, I'm going to be you tomorrow. So I think it's really promising when we're actually seeing these tipping points around things like cycling, because it creates kind of an empathy factor for people in different modes, which is really what we need. So I can't really choose between those things. They seem like they're all related and they should all happen simultaneously.
Yeah, I mean, public transportation is a huge problem where I live, and I think we're going to have a lot of problems for a long time until MTA can kind of step up to the plate. But what are some of the biggest differences you've seen between sort of the public sector work and working with someplace like Stanford or another campus? It doesn't have to be us, but between those two client bases or the population that you're serving, what are you seeing as main differences?
Well, I'll take this opportunity to just pander shamelessly to my audience, which is that Stanford's really been fun to work with, and one of the reasons is I think the level of sort of thoughtfulness about culture and intention. And I think if you're a campus, or if you're an academic institution, you're thinking in these long-term timeframes. And I would say that's probably the main difference in these different client types, right? And cities are similar. So cities are sort of thinking in budget cycles and 3 to 5 year timeframes. Campuses are actually often thinking in sort of like decadal timeframes or a century. And private corporations, in my experience, are generally thinking in terms of quarters and kind of this year. So it doesn't mean that all the thinking is totally short term, but I think you always have to put what you're doing in terms that the partner, who's your client, is thinking in. And so with I think the more corporate clients, it's really kind of been about like, how do we align, how do we show some results like really relatively soon. And with cities and campuses, is a much more patient process.
We also have this added challenge we talk about in our office a lot, though, where our population is totally changing over every 4 years. The vast majority of our population, I'm referring to as students, but that's who we ultimately serve foremost, is those students, and we want them to have a great experience for the time they're here. And yet sometimes they help us in the early part of a project and they're gone by the time it's implemented. And it's, you've replaced these folks with people that might have totally different values or be from a totally different background. And so that's kind of challenging for us to just keep up with our constituents in a way. It's a really interesting challenge. Any mentors or influences along the way in your career that you want to talk about?
Well, that's a great question. There've been a lot of folks that I feel like have taught me a lot. In the early days of doing Rebar, actually, it was my co-founders, Matt and John, were like, we were teaching each other lots of things, and I just learned a lot from working with them and kind of, seeing the world through their eyes, through that kind of just super collaborative practice. The first boss I had, actually, Aditya Advani. Hi, Aditya. Thanks for telling me how to do a construction drawing set and how to think about how people walk around a space. He has a great eye for that, and would always kind of lean over my shoulder and sort of whisper that. More recently, I've become really interested in kind of how people in other disciplines think about their design. So, we work quite a bit with IDEO, and folks at IDEO teach me a lot about sort of how to think about a design problem. And I really appreciate actually this kind of design thinking perspective, that sort of like any problem can be framed in a design lens. And I had really come out of design school thinking about landscape. Landscape is my design problem. And being around people who constantly kind of enlarge the design problem to something else, something, more about human endeavor, or maybe we're not designing a landscape at all. Maybe we're designing a governance system, but you can't have the landscape without the governance system. So that kind of frame shift has been really helpful. Shout out to Tim Brown at IDEO, who's had some great conversations with me over the years on that.
Yeah, it's something that resonates with me too. We come out of school wanting to make decisions and design, and you've done something really admirable to kind of step back and think about from a very human perspective and an empathetic perspective, and not worry about all the little details and solutions, but hold that off as long as possible until you have all the information to help everybody make good decisions. And there's not really an academic program that's focusing on the kind of work that you all are doing, and that approach to design, right? So, I mean, I always like to end with this question, which is any advice you might have for young architects and landscape architects and urban designers, folks coming out of school or just out of school, because you've taken such a different path and you have such a great social mission that you're working on now.
Yeah, well, first let me say that I have a ton of appreciation for designers who get things built. And I think it's a craft that I really do appreciate. And, hopefully nothing in what I'm saying can be, construed that that's not important. I think it's the collaboration between the sort of observation and behavior study and that craft of building things that's so exciting to me. So my advice, for other designers is, do take time to observe. I mean, take time to really watch what people do. And there's so many great guides on that journey. I mean, obviously people like Jane Jacobs and, Holly White and Jan Gehl, you can read all the books. Literature is a great guide there too, just the narrative of the city and kind of how the small moments that people live enabled by design. And then finally, I just would say my best advice is, I don't know, this is maybe just to try and justify my own path, but the lateral move, do something for a while and then do something totally different, change careers often. And if you're interested in something, I mean, I've been interested in cities this whole time, but I've really kind of tried to change where I'm coming at the problem from. If you're interested in something, I think that interest will come through no matter where you sit. But changing where you sit constantly will give you a lot of appreciation for the complexity of the problem. And I think hopefully some humbleness, in how complicated things are, and maybe, some skill in trying to translate to all the different actors. And hopefully one of those things will be the job that's exactly perfect for you.
I love that answer. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was such a different talk, and you just bring such a different perspective to this realm that we're dealing with. So I really appreciate it, and I appreciate how much heart you put into all your work. And I hope we get a chance to collaborate at some point soon. And wish you the best of luck on everything.
Thanks, Zach. It was great hanging out. See you soon.
All right. Have a good night.
Okay, bye-bye.